All right. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Dr. Sharon Milgram, and I direct the NIH Office of Intramural Training and Education. And if it's Monday, it must be time for a workshop. In fact, I think mostly we've done them at either 2 or 3, so it's starting to be a real tradition for Monday afternoon. For those of you new to the workshops that we've been offering, you can find information on them all at training.nih.gov. And I realize that I have been remiss in not getting a listserv started so that people can get updated regularly. I think I've been in this mode of we're going to go back to work soon, and we'll all be back busy with other things, and I just haven't attended to it, but I appreciate that. It's frustrating for some of you not to be getting information directly, and I commit to getting something out to everyone who's registered so that you can have information about what's coming up next. Today is Essential Leadership Skills for Scientists, and just a couple of things. Handouts are in the box down below to the right. You should be able to access them yourself. Hopefully you can hear me. It would be great if someone, maybe Aditi, could send an email saying that that you can hear me loud and clear. Or Adriana, I'm flipping through the A's, that would be really helpful. If the slides freeze at some point, just quit and re-enter. This is going to be taped, and so you should be able to watch it later if you miss any part of it. Likewise, if you have audio issues and suddenly you can't hear me, assume first that it's you, back out and try to re-enter. And lots of people have told me they can hear me, so thank you very, very much. So with that introduction, I want to dive in to the material, and normally this would be a nice discussion of everyone together, but unfortunately we can't do that. So I thought I would just start out by defining what I mean by leadership. And that is the art and science of sharing your vision so that others can join you in making it a reality. It's the ability to influence and direct others to accomplish a mission, a task, a goal. It's to have an idea of where you want to head, whether that be your science or a change that you want to make in your community, in a group that you work with. It's having a vision of a change you'd like to see happen and leading people towards that direction. One thing we tend to always think about is that leadership comes from the top. But really, the honest truth is that leadership can and does come from the top, but it also often comes from within a group or organization. All of you have the opportunity every day to be leaders within your lab group, within your postdoc association or graduate student council, within your department, within a community that you take part in. We all have the opportunity to be a leader. So I'd like you to spend a moment yourself and just think about some leaders that you admire. But more importantly, I'd like to ask yourself why you admire this individual. And rather than thinking about the big public national figures that we tend to think about in questions like this, I'd like you to look right around your environment or near around your environment and think about people maybe a little closer. Then zoom out and think about big national figures or international figures, local figures. But I'd like you to really give some thought to people right around you. And the reason for that is, as we're developing our own leadership skills, we want to learn from what we see around us. And I think we often learn by seeing bad leadership, but it's really inspiring to learn by looking at good leadership. And so thinking about who you admire and who you think is a good leader can be a really powerful beginning. There's a question about whether you can share the slides. You can share the slides with whomever you would like. The video will be taped and at the exact same link, and eventually within about a week it'll be closed captioned and moved over to our YouTube channel, which is the NIHOITE YouTube channel. But for now you can use the same link. So a couple things that we need to do to be a good leader. First and foremost, we need to develop our ethical and moral foundation. We need to really know who we are and what we see as our important moral values and principles. We need to understand ourselves, and I've talked a lot, for those of you who've listened to several of my talks, I talk a lot about self-awareness, and we'll talk a lot about self-awareness again today. So we really need to understand ourselves. We also have to have insight into ways that we can understand our colleagues and our coworkers, people who work with us, our students, trainees, bosses. We need to know all the people around us. We need to have some ability to understand them. And we also have to understand the environment we work in, right? What that environment is like, what are the cultural norms of our environment, where can we get away with stretching a little bit away from those cultural norms, how it's best to get things done within our environment. So there's knowing ourselves, knowing others, and knowing the environment. Communication skills are probably the fundamental skill of leadership. So we need to develop our communication skills and the ways that we interact with people around us and organizational systems around us that we need to interact with. And then finally, we need to develop our own resilience, or our ability to deal gracefully with setback. And we need to promote resilience in our organizations and groups that we work with. So in many ways, collectively, you could call this using and developing your emotional intelligence. And if you don't know much about the emotional intelligence literature, I'm going to introduce you to that. But first, I thought I would just throw up a slide. I don't actually know who made this slide, although many of these slides I made, somebody must have borrowed this deck at one point and added some slides of their own and then sent it back. And I look at this and I say, whoa, right? I mean, really, to become a leader means to develop ourselves in so many different areas. It really takes a lot of practice and thought and care to become a well-rounded leader. And I suspect that you could sit here and add 10 more things to this list. And so in some ways, that's why I really like the language of thinking about it from the perspective of emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence is a phrase coined in the early 1990s by Peter Salovey and Jack Mayer, and they were looking at why it was that people who were incredibly gifted technical experts were not always the best of leaders. And so they coined this phrase, emotional intelligence, in saying that much of our success in the workspace is not exclusively tied to our technical abilities, but it really is tied to our social intelligence or emotional intelligence. And they define that as the ability to recognize and manage our own emotions and to recognize and manage the emotions of others. Emotional intelligence is composed of a set of skills that you can learn and develop. And you do that through self-awareness, spending a lot of time in reflection of what's my personality, what's my communication style, how do I handle conflict, how do I handle stress. So it's self-awareness, accurate self-assessment, what are my skills and what are my skills that I still need really to develop. We develop our emotional intelligence through feedback and through practice. So really, the beautiful thing about emotional intelligence is that these are learned skills, and we develop emotional intelligence over time through self-reflection, self-assessment, feedback, and practice. Now, the whole concept was introduced first within the sphere of the organizational management literature, and then a New York Times writer, Dan Goleman, really popularized the idea, and he wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence, Why It Can Matter More Than Your IQ, and he has written many books since then. And if you want to learn about emotional intelligence, just Googling Dan Goleman and finding some of his books would go a long way. But here at the bottom of this slide set, I gave you the link to a website called positivepsychology.com, and they have a list of about 25 of what they consider to be the best emotional intelligence books. So I want to put emotional intelligence into just this pictorial view. So if you think about it, our brain exists in some way, and especially initially evolved to sense threat. Our brain has a built-in negativity filter because its primary first job is to keep us safe, and it's much more important that we see the dangers in front of us than we pay attention to something pleasurable and enjoyable and positive in front of us. Right, so sometimes when I talk about this, I say evolutionarily, we could either eat lunch, live to eat lunch, or we could be lunch, right? If we weren't careful, we would be in danger and we would end up succumbing to that danger. So we have this really exquisitely sensitive limbic system that is a threat sensor, and our sort of our emotional or archae or reptilian brain. Now, on top of that, we've evolved this rational brain and all kinds of higher cognitive functions and executive functions and reasoning. But often we are still driven by our limbic system, right? And emotional intelligence is when we have the ability to calm our limbic system so that our rational brain can engage to help solve a problem. While an argument at work or the Zoom crashing right before your thesis defense might seem like a mortal danger in the moment, the honest truth is that it's not, and that if we can take a deep breath and re-engage our rational brain, we can problem solve. And so the idea behind emotional intelligence is that we can engage our rational brain to solve problems using our higher cortical functions, but also by paying attention to those emotions that are sensed predominantly through those faster systems of our nervous system. So that was not the best of descriptions, but it was a good one to get us started. And you can just think about it this way. We can either react to a problem quickly and not very well thought out, or we can respond, having had a moment to collect ourselves and think it through. So in one picture, emotional intelligence is the ability to engage our rational brain. Now, diving deeper, and we're going to get deeper and deeper, there are 4 domains of emotional intelligence to think about. Self-awareness, or what's going on for me right now. Self-management, okay, knowing what I know is going on, how will I manage myself? How will I calm myself, control myself? How will I behave in this situation? So that's one side of the equation. And then the other side is social awareness. Okay, what's going on around me? I just had a staff meeting earlier today, and you know, everybody's on Zoom, and I'm looking at the screen of 30-some people flipping back and forth. And from body language and facial expressions, can I get a sense of what's happening? That's harder to do over a screen, but that's what social awareness is. Can I sense the mood here? Can I sense the stresses, the tensions? Can I connect with people enough to use that information to drive my behavior and decision making? That's social awareness. And the fourth one is relationship management. Just like I need to manage myself, can I manage these relationships? So 4 areas: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, and relationship management. All right, that is useful, but still really big. Like if I sat here and said, oh, I should really work on my self-management, I wouldn't even know hardly where to begin. And so people who are experts in emotional intelligence did us a huge favor in breaking down each of these 4 areas into what are known as competencies. Now, you can look a lot at the competencies written by experts in this field by following the link at the bottom of the slide. And I took competencies out of the work of off of this website and resources within there, but they're modified somewhat by me, in part to make them accessible to scientists that I work with, so that I'm using common language from other leadership material that we teach. So some of it is semantics for me in making it easier to teach the material, and some of it is to be a little bit more clear in what I think the trainees that I tend to work with and the faculty that I work with could think about. So you might look on the EI Consortium website and see some competencies that resonate for you a little bit better. I think this is a nice comprehensive list that gives a lot to work with. Under self-awareness, the first of all the important competencies is recognizing our own emotions. Actually knowing when we're angry, sad, happy, frustrated, distracted. It's also knowing our triggers and hot buttons. So all of us have things that get us really angry really quickly, right? We go from 0 to 100 in anger really quickly. And generally we think as triggers and hot buttons that we get more angry than might be necessary, right? Because they're things that poke at us. Self-awareness is also understanding our personality, our communication style, the way we give and receive feedback. That's a subset of our communication style, and our conflict styles and what we do in conflict. So it's understanding a lot about who we are and how we move within the world. And it's also about knowing our skills and developmental needs. The things we're good at that come reasonably easy to us, the things we're getting good at, but don't come as easy, the things we really struggle with, where we could tend to avoid them unless we're really aware. Also, it's a being able to know, oh, I'm sorry about that, the phone is ringing here, I apologize. It's also knowing when we're not good at something, is this something really important that I need to be good at, and doing something about it. So that's self-awareness. Self-management at the start is controlling negative emotions, and that goes together with managing stress. And I know we are in very stressful times right now, and so managing stress is something that hopefully many of us are thinking about, and maybe even investing some time into developing those skills. But it's a critical self-management skill for the long term. Another element of self-management is having and conveying appropriate self-confidence, not overconfidence, but also not underconfidence. It's acting with integrity. It's dealing with setback appropriately or having the right level of optimism. It's being appropriately driven. And notice I didn't just say being driven, because sometimes we're too driven, and we're so driven that we ignore our integrity, or we're so driven that we push people in our staff in incredibly intense pace, and then things crash and burn. So it's being appropriately driven. It's also being flexible and adaptable. And then finally, it's controlling edges in our personality, communication, feedback, and conflict style. And what I mean by that is us knowing the pros and cons, the strengths and liabilities of our communication style, our personality, the way we deal in conflict, the way we give and receive feedback, and softening it to make it work. So fundamentally, we generally can't change who we are. We're a mix of nature and nurture for so long, right? Meaning we've absorbed things from our environment that drive us to behave the way we do. Our genetics drive us to behave the way we do. And it's not like we can fundamentally change it, but we can sort of soften things that don't work for us. And with effort, we can make some serious change. So I like to refer to it as controlling the edges in those things. And as we go through some things in terms of communication and personality and conflict styles, maybe you'll see what I mean. And then in the realm of social awareness, one thing is accurately reading the emotions of others. right? Can we look at others and sense when they might be uncomfortable, sense when they might be struggling, so that we know how to, so that we reach out. It's having empathy for others, or the ability to put ourselves in their shoes. You know, during this period of prolonged self-quarantine and telework, I think it's hard for everyone, but it's harder for some people. I have staff members that have little kids, right? My son is grown and living in LA, and right, I don't have to worry about getting somebody set up for Zoom learning, or I don't have to worry about nap time, feeding kids. But can I have empathy that my staff members who do need my patience right now, and flexibility during this telework period? Social awareness is also understanding our organization, how it works, what the cultural norms are, how best to get things done, who are the people who might have some power, how does one navigate change in our organization. And then the fourth competency of social awareness is having a service orientation. And this comes a little bit from the business world. So having a service orientation means we keep in mind that we have a responsibility to serve others. And at one point when I was preparing this material and working with it around science and research environments, I thought, well, you know, do we really have, does that really, is that really appropriate? Is that one that's really relevant to scientists? But I think it is. If we teach, we serve our students. If we do research, we serve the communities that we do research for. In the lab, those of us who are mentors, we in many ways serve our mentees. And so I wish that we all could think a little bit more about having a service orientation. I know as I've worked with this material, it's helped me to put my role in my work into perspective. And then there's a whole lot of things under relationship management: influencing others and motivating them, inspiring them, promoting teamwork and collaboration, mentoring or developing others, right? You are only as strong as the people who you lead, so you want to develop them. It's using active listening skills. It's developing our ability to give and receive feedback, or what I like to call feedback resilience. It's promoting the inclusion of diverse individuals and defining diversity as broadly as possible. And then finally, it's dealing effectively with conflict and difficult conversations. And so these are some of the competencies that you want to develop as you develop your emotional intelligence. And those of you really taken by this material should go to the EI Consortium. There also that positive psychology website that I gave you a link to in the previous slide. There's some really rich material to explore emotional intelligence and the various competencies. So I want to say one thing. So we should look down these lists and we sort of look, oh, I think I'm pretty good at that one. Oh, I need some work at that one. Ooh, that one I'm really not good at all. But that one I am. But I want to make a couple of points. So first, we tend to look and we see where we're strong. So strengths are really important. We want to know what are our strengths so we can use them. But we also want to keep in mind that we tend to go to our strengths again and again, and strengths overused or used at the wrong time become liabilities. Okay, so people, I'll give examples as we move along through the workshop in that, but people will often point out something that they do really well. I'm really extroverted. I can make people feel very comfortable. I can really get to know anyone very, very quickly. My ability to communicate with people is a real strength. Then I go on a job interview and I talk and I talk and I talk and I never listen. And people say, oh, not such a great listener. Strengths overused or used at the wrong time become liabilities. The other thing that I want to say about emotional intelligence is a big part of leadership and emotional intelligence is coming to appreciate that when it comes to leading others, none of us can make anyone do something they don't want to do. So becoming a leader is not forcefully getting people to do things. It's all of those competencies under relationship management: active listening, developing, promoting, inspiring, motivating. Look at those words, right? It's looking at my team and making sure it's diverse. It's dealing with conflict in a respectful way. It's so many things about connecting with people so that they want to follow you, so that they can give you feedback when they think you're directing them in the wrong way. So much of emotional intelligence is about engaging with people in a calm, clear, direct, affirming way. And I know that in science environments, sometimes we forget about that, and we get so focused on the outcome that we don't focus so much on how we got where we got. So I just want to encourage you to keep in mind that the most effective leaders lead people because people are pleased to be working with them and to be following them and to be joining them on that journey. And then one last thing, if you're not uncomfortable, you're not learning. And I think when we look at this list, what we want is the easy way. Lots of people will sign into a lecture like this, right? And it feels so good. I learned some things. I have some aha moments. I get some insight. But if we really want to improve our emotional intelligence and we really want to develop our leadership, we have to really put ourselves out there to practice. And so it takes really a lot of work and effort to develop leadership skills. And for those of you who heard me talk about resilience earlier, I talked about having a growth mindset. And it really does take a growth mindset to become an effective leader, meaning we have to embrace our mistakes and really learn from them. I have to say I'm having quite an aha moment about that myself right now, because last week I had what I thought was a great idea, but I didn't think it through very carefully, and I started to execute it before I was ready. I was a little bit busy, so I executed it in a distracted way, and it hasn't been as successful as I had hoped. And I'm having to take a deep breath and see the positives, but also all the out spots and make change. And I have to say, it's been a sort of uncomfortable day and weekend for that reason. And so I just want to stress that, that's a big part of it. We learn by trying and doing. And so it's really important for us to keep that in mind. So I'm going to give a few more slides and then I'll take some questions. All right, I see a bunch of questions coming up in the question box. So how do we develop our emotional intelligence competencies? So I gave a little bit about that in the earlier slide, but I just want to really define it here. So we learn, first of all, by doing. We look at that list and we intentionally work to develop in areas that we think are important to us. And as we're doing, we reflect on both the process and the outcome. The outcome is what happened. I set out to accomplish A, did I accomplish A? But process is how did I accomplish it, right? So for example, I could have a project that I want done, and I could, with incredible force and some threat, tell people do it or else, and maybe I will get the outcome I want. That's the outcome. But the process is, did I cultivate teamwork? Did I develop others? Did I treat people on my team in a way that will make them want to help me the next time? So process and outcome. So we reflect on those things, we learn through that reflection, and then the next time we do things a little bit differently. The best ways to facilitate the learning process, first of all, are reading books and blogs and videos. And I gave you some suggestions of books in previous workshops. You just get on that emotional intelligence website, watch, Google and watch videos, follow things that you find online. Workshops and courses go a long way, and those of you here clearly have an interest and concern for developing these skills. Talking with peers, right? Sharing experiences, talking about what happened, getting feedback. We put ourselves in situations where we can grow and learn. So we step up. We want to develop leadership skills. So we step up in our lab to organize something, to host a collaborator who's coming for a while. We look for opportunities where we can practice those skills. We talk with mentors, and especially mentors who know us well and mentor us beyond our science. Sometimes your PI is a good science mentor, but not a great mentor about developing leadership skills and emotional intelligence. But hopefully for some of you, your PI is a great source of this. But it could be someone down the hallway. It could be someone on your committee. It could be someone who knew you from your previous educational or research experience. But we talk with people, both our peers and our mentors. One great way for developing emotional intelligence and leadership skills is to have a leadership journal. And I've talked already in a number of these workshops about journaling. I think it's such a powerful tool. And many people advocate for having a leadership journal. And I know, as I told you, I'm struggling with a project that didn't go quite as I had hoped. And this morning I actually sat down and jotted down some notes. And before I knew it, I was actually sketching out some arrows. This went to that, it went to this. And then suddenly I saw a better way forward. So I think that sometimes it's great for short-term problem solving, but it's really good for long-term, looking for patterns in the way you interact with people, what your hot buttons might be, how you respond in conflict. So get yourself a nice journal when you get a chance and give it a try. And then finally, for many of us, emotions aren't something we grew up really gaining an appreciation for. Maybe we lived in a family where you had to be happy and you couldn't share any negative emotions, or maybe, oh, I'm sorry. This time I learned to actually put my phone in silent mode. Or maybe you grew up in a household so full of negative emotions where people let them run wild. But some of us grew up really not having a chance to learn about, recognize, name, and accept our emotions. And so sometimes I think we are our own biggest barrier to developing these skills. And one great way beyond all of the ones that I mentioned that I want to put out there is finding a therapist and talking through issues around emotional regulation, around recognizing emotions, managing emotions, around how I interact with people. I feel like it's very, very hard to develop emotional intelligence competencies. And, you know, it's interesting if you look in the literature now, or books, you can read books about raising emotionally intelligent children and emotionally intelligent families and conflict resolution in emotionally intelligent ways. I mean, if you think about it, our ability to know how we're feeling and to manage those feelings is sort of at the heart of our success in a lot of things. I'll say not only have many of us not gotten those great role models at home, but the honest truth is we don't always have the best of role models in science. And so I think it's important to really, if we decide we want to embrace developing our leadership skills, it's important to ask that question: where do I see emotionally intelligent leaders around me, and where do I see them in science? Because I think that gives us a real chance to develop these skills. I have to say, as somebody where many of them didn't come naturally, as I've developed more and more ability at self-awareness and self-management, that everything, work, life, everything is easier and better. There's something about not having that, those terrible ups and downs of anger and negative energy and disconnection and conflict. There's something about finding ways to navigate that in a calmer way. So I'm going to give you two exercises for later: a journaling exercise about a time when you felt you did really well in the EI realm, and a time where your EI sort of failed you and you just wish that you could have done things differently. And you can journal about those at some point when you have some time. And so I'm going to take a few questions right now. So the first one is, if we're lacking in some of these, how do we go about fixing and developing them? For each one, you want to do different things, right? So it depends which one you're trying to develop. But say, for example, you're trying to become more aware of your hot buttons and how you deal with conflict. For 3 weeks, commit every time you get disproportionately angry to write about it. from a curious perspective, not a I have to defend myself perspective, but why did I get angry? What happened before? What happened right during the situation? What was the context beyond it? Um, and so that's how you might tackle that one. If you really struggle with emotional regulation, as I said, counseling is a great adjunct or primary way to do that. Let's say you realize that I am not a great active listener and that I don't get very good feedback. So you would take some workshops on communication skills and feedback, and then you might ask to supervise a summer student so that you could practice giving feedback. Or you would pair up with some students in your department in a support group to practice giving, working with scenarios, etc. So it depends what you're trying to go about. And I wouldn't use the word fixing so much as developing. So I like that you use the word developing. I'm going to talk about conflict styles in a little bit. That question was, how do we know our conflict style? This one is, I feel it's hard to show my skills and thoughts, sometimes due to language barriers and my age and gender. And sometimes before I start talking, older people already look at me in a skeptical way. It makes me even less confident. And so thank you for sharing that. I am filled with awe and respect for those of you who came here to the United States to do science from so far away, where there's cultural differences and language barriers, and where you're right, people, so many of us make assumptions about people based on how they look. And even if we don't intentionally want to do that, especially when we're not aware of it, we tend to do it even more. And a way to deal with these kinds of issues, some of it is to share within student groups where it's easier to practice your language skills. You might ask someone in your lab to give you some feedback on when you speak up. Do you use assertive body language and assertive language? Taking English courses, practicing, watching movies, all kinds of ways to develop your skills. Now, some of this isn't skills, it's a lacking of confidence that comes from being new in an environment with cultural messages about hierarchy and power and how to be assertive, and understanding all of that helps a lot. And I'm going to recommend a book called Clash. And if you can't find it, you can just send me an email and I will send you a link to it. And it talks about the cultural differences between the United States and other countries, and gives us some insight into our communication style and how it's impacted that way. And I know that was maybe not the best, an in-depth enough answer, and I'm going to talk a little bit about opportunities to practice in a little bit. I'm not going to answer this question about communicate if your communication skills don't match your team member, because I'm going to talk about that later. All right. So here's a great one. As a postdoc, how do you effectively lead projects that have research assistants who may not be as invested in the research? So, you know, I start my talk to tenure track PIs and say, so this is an inherently stressful thing you're doing, and here's a couple reasons why. And one is that maybe nobody else in your group loves this as much as you do, and you might be lucky eventually to get some trainees who really love it, right? But some people come to work for a paycheck. Some people come to work because it's their passion. Some people come to work because they're trying to figure out what to do next, and they haven't figured it out yet. And so we have to be realistic. We have to talk to people about what they enjoy. Generally, when we engage people in decision making, they tend to be happier at work. And the happier people are, the more they're likely to contribute. There's a whole literature on motivating people, and that literature generally shows that people Everyone likes to be motivated differently, and you need to figure out how people like to be motivated and then work with them in that way. And I think we will probably offer a workshop on motivating and managing others later this month. Here are some things about communication styles that I'm gonna leave out for now. Here's a request to expand a little on a leadership journal. So one thing is just Google keeping a leadership journal, and that will help. But in general, what I mean by that, so I often will sit down almost always on Saturday. I usually have a little bit of time. I don't want to work, but I want to be sort of reflective about work and accomplish something around work. And I'll think about a situation that week that is important to me, that either went really well, or most often I'll focus on something that didn't go as well as I'd liked. And the first part is I write about what happened, and I write about my thoughts and my feelings. I might pause and try to, why did I get so, well, like the other day in a staff meeting, before the question was fully asked, I had already said, no, we're not going to do that, right? And then I was like, why did I do that? What was going on for me? And so you just write about what's happening, then you write about things you wish you had done differently, how you might try that. All right, so that's what I mean by that. Somebody's asking about leadership fellowship programs that visiting fellows can apply to. The leadership program at NIH, for those of you at NIH, is called the Workplace Dynamics Series, and we teach a 5-part program, and then you can take a 2-day management course. And I'm not sure if that's what you mean, Alfonso, or you want something to actually transition career-wise. So you send me an email and we can try to talk about that a little bit. Here's a question about difficult mentors, and I'm going to talk about difficult mentors next week. On Monday, I'm going to do something called Managing Up. Here's one: how do we handle uncomfortable people who are learning under us? They get offended or have low confidence. So sometimes I want to attribute all of the issues of somebody who works for me to them, and then I decide, well, I play a role in this too. So we ask ourselves, how might I work with this person differently? What might I say or do differently? Am I giving feedback that's decreasing their confidence? And a lot of this, I think, goes into the nuts and bolts of managing people, and I will try to give you some workshops on that over the next month. How do you manage your drive if you don't have always have a drive to be super productive? So first of all, I think we have to appreciate that maybe sometimes, remember I said appropriately driven, so sometimes we should not be pushing towards being maximally productive. We need to recharge our battery. We don't want to get burnout. But if we're never driven and we're coming to work every day and we don't feel driven in any way, it's a sign of that we need to make change, whether that be a change of the career or a change of the environment we're in. If we never feel driven at all, we need to ask ourselves what's happening for us physically, mentally, emotionally. We need to ask if we're in the right place. Here's a question about one part of emotional awareness or social awareness is reading body language, right? And indirect cues. And that is very challenging given that we work in such a multicultural environment. And that's true. And one of the things that I have done in terms of that I think has helped me a lot is I've started to watch movies and read books as much as I can about other cultures. Sometimes if you are comfortable with someone, you can ask for some feedback, right? Here in the U.S., how does this, how is this perceived? in my culture where I grew up, people point fingers at each other all the time. We would debate and everybody's pointing at each other, and it's really not acceptable in many cultures. And I've had to work really hard to stop doing that. And so we read about body language, we watch movies of people in different cultures. We appreciate that there's no one right way. And if we do something wrong, we say, I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. There is no perfect way to do that. There's a number of questions on there's a number of questions about how to develop self-confidence, and we will be holding, thank you for that. I was going to ask actually at the end what topics are we missing, and I can tell from this that self-confidence is one of them. A question about, because now we're all wearing masks, how much harder it is to tell how people are, you know, like what's going on, because we read so much from their facial expressions. So I've been trying really hard out on the street to say hello to everyone, because I agree that that's something really missing. I also have noticed there's a picture I took, I don't know, because we're doing this wellness challenge and I had to post it on Twitter, and I could actually sort of tell from my eyes that I was smiling, but I bet nobody else could. And so I think we're going to need to be a little bit more intentional about letting people know how we feel if we have to go back to work wearing masks and on the streets and things. There's a comment about, and that I accidentally hit delete on, about that it would be really nice to have a list of emotionally intelligent role models. And so if you want to, I don't know if the chat box works for all of you, but if it does, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. If not, my hope is that I'm gonna talk later about meeting in small groups to discuss some of this stuff. So hopefully we can do that another time. But that's a really nice question. There's some things about handling your boss and bullies and difficult people, and we're gonna talk about that next week when we talk about managing up. And here is some comments about people on research teams that make comments about postdocs, whether they have funding or not, whether they're independent or not. I guess and there's a lot about that. How do I deal with somebody who makes negative comments about this or that? And I guess I'm going to say something not very satisfying. So I used to say things like, especially about my son, but also at work, I'd say, so-and-so made me mad. My son's name is Wonder. Okay, so I would say, oh, Wonder made me so mad today. And then one time somebody pointed out to me, and it's so true, that Wonder can't make me mad. The only person who can make me mad is me. Wonder can do something that makes me disappointed, feels a little bit, you know, hard for me to accept, but it's me who takes his action and internalizes it and isn't able to put it into perspective. And so in some ways, I think we have to be able to let go of unkind things that people say. Now, there's a limit there, right? People shouldn't be allowed to totally take advantage of us or harass us or bully us. So I'm not advocating that everyone just accept everything, but I'm advocating that occasionally we let something go. And I'll talk in the conflict section, if we can get to it, I'll talk a little bit about that. And it may be that I don't get through all of this today and we'll just finish it next time. But I'm hoping that as I get through the conflict part, maybe you can understand a little bit what I mean. So if somebody says so-and-so doesn't have money, I think we need to ask ourselves, does that get in the way of my ability to do work? And if it doesn't, I think we want to take a deep breath and let it go. I think we want to be able to distinguish how important is this to us or not. A question about the line between service to others versus being a doormat and always serving others and you never meet your own needs. And remember what I said, strengths overused become liabilities. And so if all we ever do is meet other people's needs and never meet our own, then we have taken service orientation too far. And again, that all comes back to self-awareness. And then why is that? Why do I do that? And my guess is it's messages that we get from all the different communities we've been in, the families we've been in. We get these messages. These messages drive our behavior and we're not even aware of them. And then when we realize it, we have to say, how do I make change? And we make change by making small steps in safe environments. And that's one of the reasons why so many times in these workshops, I say, if you're struggling with this, find a therapist, because we need support to make those changes. We need somebody to help us put them in perspective, to help us understand what gets in the way. We need people to give us encouragement and support. So I'm going to stop here because I'm afraid we're not going to get past anymore. And I think I've covered a lot of these, and some of these are becoming will be good for later. Okay, so I'm going to leave these. So we're going to talk a little bit about self-awareness, and we're going to start with some things on communication. And I just want to point out that we communicate for a whole lot of different reasons, right? As a leader, we need to give and get information. Sometimes we communicate to cause change, to vent emotion, to create excitement, to feel seen and heard and valued and respected. Sometimes we just communicate because it's uncomfortable. The quiet is very, very uncomfortable. But usually the primary reasons are listed up above on this slide. And then we communicate in writing, we communicate verbally, and as already has been pointed out, we communicate using all kinds of nonverbal communication. Our paralanguage, which is our tone, our pitch, the emotion. I realize that I often convey a huge amount of intensity in my communication, and it comes from that paralanguage. But it also comes from facial expressions, eye contact, body posture, etc. So those are nonverbals. And remember, as somebody pointed out, we're losing some nonverbals right now with these masks that we're all wearing out in public, but we still have other ways that we can convey information, and we want to be more careful to use those as we walk around in public with masks. I also think it's especially important for white people to appreciate that we maybe judge people wearing masks differently depending on the color of their skin, and that's an unconscious bias that is inappropriate and really needs to be controlled, right? That right now we're all wearing masks for safety, and it's really a microaggression to make an assumption that somebody's hiding something because they're wearing a mask. So not only do we have issues around masks in terms of, let me try to connect with this person, but we also have to avoid making assumptions about people. We also communicate with what we wear, the symbols, right? If we have tattoos, if we are wearing a necklace that conveys something about who we are or what we believe. So there's all kinds of ways we communicate. Now, all of us have particular communication styles, and I want to give you some ways to think about them. And the first I'm going to start with is from the perspective of the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, or MBTI, which if you don't have any familiarity with this, you can Google and learn about. The MBTI says that a part of our inherent personality and way of being in the world is how we prefer to direct our energy and how we receive energy. So some of us receive energy by interacting with people, by doing things. We get energy by being out in public and interacting with people. We like to direct our energy outward, and we gain energy by being out and interacting with people. And this is known as extroversion, or people with a preference for extroversion. On the other hand, are individuals who prefer to direct energy towards their inner world, and they gain energy by reflecting internally on ideas and experiences. They're much more contained, and when they're out in public all day, they're drained. as opposed to someone with a preference for extroversion. When they're out in public all day, they're energized. So on one end of the spectrum is extroversion, on the other end is introversion, and we can fall in between. We can be a little bit extroverted, we can be sort of in the middle, maybe right in the middle. Some people say there's no such thing as right in the middle. Some people say there is, but we could be a very strong person with a preference for introversion, or we can have a slight preference. All right, each of us has a preference though. Now, if you think about it, this is how they look and sound like. People with a preference for extroversion, they talk out loud, they think out loud. When you go talk to them and you say, what do you think I should do? They might give you 6 ideas. You could try this, or you could try that, or what do you think about that? You know what, I think you should do both of those, right? They talk out loud. They prefer verbal communication, so they are not emailing a whole lot right now. They are on Zoom, let's get together. And generally, because they get so much energy by communicating, they can find listening very difficult. Also, they prefer action over reflection. These are students, if you have a very strongly extroverted student who works for you, that student, you say, let's try this experiment, and the next thing you know, they're in the freezer pulling things out, or on the computer doing the analysis. They really like action, not so much reflection. People with a strong preference for extroversion love to work in groups, and they often appear very approachable and social. Now, remember, I said strengths overused become liabilities. So sometimes our extroversion means we talk way too much. We don't listen enough. We take action too quickly, and we make mistakes, right? So remember, strengths overused become liabilities. Now, people who prefer introversion think first and then talk. And they tend to prefer written communication. And they're often perceived as very good listeners. They learn best by reflecting first. So when somebody who's an introvert has to start a new set of experiments, they'll read a lot of protocols. They'll look at different ones. They'll compare. They'll reflect first, not start. They like to work alone or in pairs. And often they appear very reserved and contemplative because they're not out there quite as much talking. There's a lot more reflective thinking and internal processing going on. So I just want you to spend a moment considering the way you like to direct and receive energy. Are you an extrovert or an introvert? Now, while you're thinking about that, I want to make a point that in the population at large is 50-50. And there's no gender difference here in terms of extroversion and introversion. Furthermore, I want to say that in every culture where this assessment has been done, the MBTI, and we won't do the whole thing today, we're just doing this one part, it shows that there's a 50-50 division of extroversion and introversion in all cultures. It's just that depending on the culture, there's a big impact. So for example, an introverted person in the US may seem extroverted compared to someone from, say, for example, Southeast Asia, because culturally there's just a difference in what introversion and extroversion look like in different countries. But even in the US, I'm from Philadelphia and my wife is from Dallas, Texas, and our communication styles are totally different. And I think her entire family is introverted because where I grew up, there's just such a big difference in how people behave in terms of extroversion. So it's not like you can look at somebody and decide what they are, all right? Although sometimes as you work with somebody more, you can get a sense. There's a great book called Type Talk at Work that I want to encourage you to read if you think understanding styles would be a good idea. Now, as you think about who you are, I want you to give thoughts of the strengths of your style and the liabilities of your style. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit from the perspective of leadership. Because people say, oh, you know, you have to be really outgoing to be a good leader, right? And I would agree that you have to connect with people and have good communication skills, but you can be an amazing leader with a strong preference for introversion or a great leader with a strong preference for extroversion. But you have to be aware of the strengths and the liabilities. So strengths of leadership from the perspective of an introvert, the ideas are often well thought out, right? People with a strong preference for introversion often give others more measured and careful feedback and input, right? People like to hear feedback that they can actually pay attention to, as opposed to it comes out in a torrent of energy. They tend to plan carefully. That can really facilitate success, and they can often inspire others through really thoughtful, calm engagement. So those are some strengths, but there are some liabilities too. Good ideas may never be shared with the group, right? Because it takes a lot longer for someone with a preference for introversion to share. Sometimes they like to plan so much that it slows or stops progress. And while they might be excellent at giving feedback, they might hesitate to give it, right? Because they tend to be contained and not to be engaged with people so much. And sometimes you have to engage your team in small talk. You have to socialize. You have to stay at the holiday party and chat with people. And that can be draining for people with a preference for introversion. And if they're not careful and they don't do it, then people are like, wow, she didn't want to spend any time with me. So strengths and liabilities, same thing for people with a preference for extroversion. So people with a preference for extroversion can be great at strategizing and putting ideas on the table, right? Because that's what they do. They like to talk out loud. They can be really helpful when small talk is needed. I look in my office when we have like a holiday party and all the people with a preference for introversion are serving cake, and all the people with a preference for extroversion are running around talking to students, pulling them together. People with a preference for extroversion often like to organize group activities, and that can be very, very important. And they can use their energy to inspire others. Strengths, but here are some liabilities. They often talk over other people. Good ideas can be lost in too many ideas and lots of not so good ones. They can distract groups in discussions, or they can distract groups with too many ideas, and they can exhaust others with too much energy, especially if they have introverts on their team. And for a team to be successful, we need diversity of all types, including diversity of extroversion and introversion, which means extroverts need to be careful not to exhaust others, and introverts need to make an effort to speak up. So strengths and liabilities, and this is just one way of looking at communication style. Now I want to look at another way, and those of you who took the feedback workshop saw this already. I like this grid because it gives us a way of talking about ourselves. All right, from the perspective of XY grid with assertiveness on the x-axis and responsiveness on the y-axis. Responsiveness is the degree to which others see you as attending to their needs in the interaction. It's how much they feel that you are caring about them and engaged in their needs in this interaction. Assertiveness is the degree to which you are perceived by others as attempting to get your way in the interaction. So you can think of assertiveness as task. I'm focused on the work. Responsiveness as people or relationship. I'm focused on the people. Okay. So we have an interaction and communication. Am I trying to connect with you, or am I just trying to tell you what I need you to do and move on? So think about some of those questions that you asked about how do I motivate somebody? How do I give feedback? I think I'm being really good about giving input, and they say I'm hurting their self-confidence. And just think a little bit about your communication style and theirs. And I'm not going to talk about this in great depth because I talked about it in the feedback workshop, but I think it's such an important part of leadership that I wanted to talk about it a little bit. So drivers, people high on assertiveness and low on responsiveness. So I just care about the task, not so much you. They get right to the point. They lack outward warmth. They interrupt a lot. They're not great listeners because they're not that focused on you. So why listen? They like to control the agenda, and they make very quick decisions. So think about leadership from the perspective of a driver. Here's what I want, let's go. On the other hand, we're going to move up now, high on assertiveness, but now high on responsiveness. So here's somebody that wants to attend to both task and relationship. They speak in very fast-paced ways. They use gestures. They like to control flow of the discussion. They also have trouble listening, right? Because they also are high on the assertiveness spectrum, and but they also really care about you. So they want to share emotions, ask you how you are. People who are expressives encourage a lot of informality. Oh, just call me Sharon, right? People say Dr. Milgram. I say, oh, nobody calls me that. Right? And in fact, expressive is probably my go-to communication style, although I can be a bit of a driver now and again and have to work hard to smooth that out and not use it so much. I think my son would tell you I'm way too much of a driver. So driver and expressive often, if you think that you are have a strong preference for extroversion, you'll need to think about, well, am I more of a driver or an expressive in that way? Now on the other side, we're going to go low on assertiveness. The amiable is someone who easily reaches out, listens attentively, uses a lot of warmth to connect, doesn't use power, and they like to make decisions in a logical, slow way and very based on the people involved. So think about leadership and the difference between leadership from a driver, here, do it this way, to leadership with an amiable, hey, can I get your input on this? I really see you contributing to this team. Here's what I would like to consider. What do you think? Really different. And now the fourth style, the analytical style. And this style is now low on assertiveness and low on responsiveness. So maybe the most internally directed of all of the styles. Very controlled and outwardly unemotional, likes order and time to prepare, holds their opinions back, express measured opinions, right? So they don't ever really give you a clear sense of their emotions. They'll say, well, this chapped me a little, whereas the expressive, I cannot believe what happened. You won't believe this. And the amiable will be trying to calm themselves down, right? To keep, that was difficult, but, right? And the driver just doesn't care. Well, that was upsetting. Oh, well, I don't have to like you to work with you. So these are 4 styles. Each of us has a go-to one. We might have a second one that we use some. And something interesting somebody brought up, well, when language is an issue and my self-confidence is low, I may not be fully myself in this. And that's an interesting thing to ask yourself when you are in an environment where you really feel comfortable. Is your style a little bit different? Because if it is, what we really want is to reach a point where what we show the world is who we authentically are. There's a lot in this because you want to think about your style and you want to think about your PI style. You want to think if you're mentoring students or you have a collaborator about their style. Think about how hard it must be for a driver when your boss is a driver and you're an amiable. Or think about a driver and an analytical trying to get a paper done. And we all can flex our style, but we have to really understand how to do that and learn how to do that. And people with a lot of emotional intelligence have looked at this and they know, well, I have to tone this down right now, right? Or someone's analytical, but they have to motivate a group. Well, you can't motivate a group with a short email. So you're going to have to find some way of moving a little bit up the responsiveness curve. The reason I like to teach this is we can always just think to ourselves, I need to dial down my assertiveness. I need to dial it up a little bit. I need to dial up my responsiveness. I need to dial it down a little bit. Strengths and liabilities of each from a leadership perspective. A driver may seem efficient, decisive, and candid. An expressive, you might say, wow, they're so persuasive and enthusiastic. They're such fun-loving people. This is just such a positive energy for me. Amiable, warm, and diplomatic and caring. I think all of the career counselors in our office are probably amiables. And, you know, whenever I need a little bit of care and concern, I will always go seek one of them out because they're so warm and caring. And then the analytical, they seem logical, they're systematic, they're serious. I gave you two sets of language. I like to use driver, expressive, amiable, and analytical, but some of the literature uses directive, emotive, supportive, and reflective. This comes from the book People Styles at Work, and unfortunately I took a slide out that had that reference. But it's People Styles at Work, and I'm going to give you the link to the other talk and you can go get it from there. Now, strengths overused become liabilities. So you're too much of a driver, or you use driving behavior, communication at the wrong time. You're just a pushy and abrasive person, right? Who makes rash decisions, who doesn't get input from others, and who alienates others. That is not a great leadership style, huh? So we want to use our driver style when it works, but tone it down when it doesn't work. What about the expressive? A poor listener who's impatient and impractical, who never honors commitments, always chatting, but never getting anything done. Also, not the best of leadership styles all the time. But think about it, when your team really needs a boost of energy, when you really need to motivate people, turning up your expressive style a little bit can go a long way. Amiable, a nice person who never takes a stand and avoids conflict at all costs. So many times a trainee will come and see me and I'll say, did you talk with your PI? And they'll say, oh, she or he just avoids conflict at all costs. They stay out of everything, right? And that could be because they were reflective. It could be because they're an amiable, or right? But we have to be able to take a stand to be a leader. On the other hand, sometimes being an amiable is the single most important thing you can do. Right now, during this pandemic, putting on our amiable hat and supporting people through this, that's a leadership skill that we all need. And then finally, analytical, a standoffish, cold person who's not a team player and takes perfection to an extreme. So strengths overused become liabilities. All things being equal, we want to be able to use all of these in the right place and time. Now, some of you might say there's never a reason to be a driver, but actually sometimes a deadline is coming up in an hour and the whole team is unable to make a decision and somebody stands up and says, this is the way we're going to do it. That's an example of when being a driver is really important. All right. All of these have their time and place. But we have one or two we really like to do, and we have to try to stretch and use all of them. That said, we never will just it will never be easy for us to do all four, right? When I have to put on my analytical, sit and listen, it can be very hard. Let's make a decision, right? Let's go, let's finish this. But sometimes decisions take a lot of discussion, and I have to put on my analytical hat. And the best leaders appreciate that. So after a day of a lot of introversion and analytical behavior, I might be exhausted and I'll talk the ear off of the person who happens to sit next to me on the metro. Right? So we have to have ways of working out of what comes naturally to us to be a really good leader. Communication is also about listening. And I just want to remind you that we want to think about being an active listener or using active listening skills. And that's concentrating fully on what's being said rather than just hearing the words of the speaker. Generally, what we're doing when we listen is we're preparing to speak, right? We're just preparing to speak as soon as the opportunity allows. And so I just want you to think for a moment what you need to do to actively listen. And I'm going to say right out there at the start, the first thing we have to do is put our phones away, right? It's like such a barrier to active listening. There are some great tools for active listening. We encourage or invite the speaker to share. right? So we actually lean forward. We use our body language. We might put our hands forward a little bit as if, please share with me. Clarify. We ask questions to confirm that we understand. So would you mind telling me whatever, right? Somebody starts to like I'll talk to one of my IT folks and they'll start to say there's an issue with security, and they'll start talking and I sort of don't want to listen, but then I'll say, okay, so are you telling me that our website only allows guests to register 5 times? Yes, that's what I'm saying. Okay, so clarifying. Restating, which is another way of clarifying. That's repeating in your own words what you've heard. Reflecting. Explain what you think the person is experiencing, not what they said, but what they're experiencing. So it seems to me, you could be talking to a undergrad. So as I understand it, you're pretty busy in school. This lab is large and very busy and intense, and I'm usually wrapping up by the time you have a lot of time to talk, and so it's feeling pretty overwhelming here. That's reflecting. It's also clarifying and restating. Summarizing at the end of a conversation to reiterate ideas and themes and feelings that were brought up, and validating. Thanks for coming up to me and talking about this. Now, we don't use all of these every time when we're talking to somebody, but these are all skills that we want to learn. And remember that we want to use our nonverbal communication to show that we listened. Now, people talked a little bit about in the questions about what I like to call communication blockers. These are things like interrupting people, talking over them, sarcasm. Oh, joy today for that news, right? Somebody comes to bring up something difficult. Oh, joy. Globalizing, which is really generalizing it. Somebody brings a problem and you take it to this bigger global way. Assuming mind reading. I don't need to tell you that. I'll just assume you're going to get it right using loaded language. Today I talked to a trainee who said that in a conversation, somebody said, if any of these files are lost, there'll be big consequences. That's super loaded language, and it's threatening as well. Paying partial attention is another blocker to effective communication, and hogging the stage, which is a little bit like interrupting and talking over, but it's where you make everything about you. So someone shares their stress, and instead of addressing their stress, oh yeah, I'm stressed too. That's hogging the stage. So here are some things to think about. How many of these do you do? Or when do you do them, right? Do you do them when you're tired? Do you do them when you say, yes, I can talk to you, but you really don't have time? What is it that makes you do these things? So I want to wrap up this part on communication by reminding you that our communication style comes from a mix of nature and nurture. Some of it is the time we spent in dependent and interdependent cultures. And I talked a lot about this in both the assertiveness and feedback workshop. And that book, Clash, which I referred to, talks a lot about dependent and interdependent cultures. This is also something that we've learned from our families of origin, our current families, and other important communities we spend time in. It's like we see things and we internalize them, but especially when we're young, what we see, we really tend to internalize. So our goal is to see the strengths and liabilities of our style. There's no one that's the only one that's good for leadership. They're all good for leadership. They have to be used in the right way. And we have to soften them. Remember, I said controlling the edges. That's what emotional intelligence is. So we have to use them in the right way and the right time. And we need to appreciate that our style works better in some situations than others. And then we need to slowly work to make change. So like I said, it's like smoothing out the rough edges. And I like to ask myself, is this behavior helping me or hurting me? And so some of you talked about not being very assertive, and you have some awareness about where it comes from, right? You pointed out I'm not confident in my lab, or you pointed out the culture that I grew up with. or the gender, right? You have a lot of awareness about the factors that contribute to making it hard to be assertive. So that's the first step. Self-awareness is the first step. The second step is to say, is this helping me or hurting me in this particular case? Sometimes it might help, right? You realize that you let go of little slights pretty easily. You get along with people well because of that. But then you realize it's hurting me sometimes. And somebody used that word, I feel like a doormat, or I never get my needs met. So then it's hurting. And if we realize it's hurting, then we want to make change. So I kept talking about these other workshops, and I think it might be worth it for some of you who haven't seen them to watch. One is self-advocacy for scientists, and the other is building feedback resilience. They are available on our website, which is training.nih.gov. And you can watch them. You can email me if you want the slide deck. But I'm going to give you an opportunity, and I'm actually going to say I talked about something not going well, and this is a little bit it. So I'm a little frustrated about sitting in my house talking at all of you. You all, by the questions, seem to have so many great ideas and things to discuss, and the beginning of this incredible self-awareness. And I think that you need tools to make change. And lecturing is one nice thing, but it doesn't give you tools for making change. So we are hosting these small group discussions about assertive communication, giving and receiving feedback. And no one is registering for them. And I didn't plan it very well, and I made some mistakes in the communication. I've had a little bit of a rough time around the whole thing, but there are still spaces open. And remember, I said we only learn when we're uncomfortable and out on an edge. And I cannot stress enough that talking about this material with others is a way to learn about it. And we just said that we have to learn these things in safe places. And a group of trainees with one OITE wellness advisor, all of them are really warm people. That's a safe place to learn. And so if you want to attend one of the groups, just email me. Here's my email address, Milgram S for Sharon. So Milgram S @nih.gov, and I'll email you back a link to register. We have some sessions Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. It just blows my mind that so many people will sign up and listen to me talk from a set of slides. And then I put together this way for people to actually get it in practice, and somehow I must have not messaged it well or sent it out at the wrong time. I don't know. But anyway, very few people have taken me up on it. So I think what we're going to do is talk about conflict and leave the last part out, and then I'll stay and take some questions. Because the honest truth is, beyond communication in general and feedback and being assertive, all of those are hard. The hardest thing, I think, of everything is how much conflict we deal with, not only as a leader, but one of the biggest responsibilities of leaders is to manage and deal with conflict. So let's just start by acknowledging that conflict is a disagreement between two or more people, and it's over people's needs, resources, beliefs, values, perceptions, expectations, all kinds of things. Conflict can arise from ineffective and unclear communication, but sometimes it just arises because we see things differently. So right now I'm engaged in a heated discussion, debate. I don't know if I would call it conflict, but it's getting pretty heated, and we have really clearly different views with some colleagues at NIH over how we should deal with extensions and flexibility for fellows given the pandemic. And now we were told we have to stay home another month. And I have one view of how to handle it. They have another view. We are communicating very clearly about it. I understand exactly her view and their view. They appreciate my view. We're communicating. It's just that we disagree. So communication is sometimes leads, a lack of communication sometimes leads to conflict. But the honest truth is we're all different. We all have different points of view. So conflict is inevitable. It happens all the time, which means we have to really be good at handling it. Conflict can be destructive, but it can also be very, very constructive. It can drive creativity, it can generate new ideas, it can increase involvement. When people feel really strongly about something and speak up, it can really increase their involvement in the topic. It can improve communication. Sometimes it just releases pent up emotions, and that alone can be very helpful. And it can help grow both as a team as an individual. But when it is not handled well, conflict can be incredibly destructive. It reduces productivity, it diverts our energy, it hurts our morale, it polarizes groups, it deepens difference, it causes more conflict, it leads to bad behavior. It can be terrible. So if ever there was something where you want to develop good skills, it will be around this, because effective conflict resolution can make the difference between a positive and a negative outcome. So to choose how to approach a conflict, you want to ask yourself two questions. How committed am I to my own agenda or needs? And how committed am I to the relationship and or the agenda of the other person? And these really wise people, Thomas and Kilman, work together to put this conflict mode grid together. And they talk about 5 distinct conflict resolution styles. All of them can be appropriate depending on the situation. Just like we talked about, all those communication styles can work depending on the situation. Same thing here. But just like there, where we tend to have a go-to style, with conflict, we also tend to have 1 or 2 styles that we use. But we have to learn about all 5 styles, and we have to deploy the right style in the right situation. And this is not a conflict management workshop. We will consider putting one on, but I want to introduce this, and at least you can start reading about it and thinking about it. One of the key elements of emotional intelligence is not losing it during a conflict, right? It's engaging in conflict in a positive and productive way. So there's an X and a Y axis. Assertiveness is focused on self, and cooperativeness is focused on others. And you should already be used to this a little bit, because in the communication styles, right, we had focus on self, and right, we had assertiveness and responsiveness. So these are just different language, but you'll see they overlap some. And here is the grid. 5 styles: avoiding, accommodating, compromising, competing, and collaborating. Avoiding is when we just ignore it and say nothing and don't respond. Accommodating is when we give in immediately to the other person. Compromising is when we say, okay, I'll get something I want, you get something you want, right? The ultimate thing in in-depth workshops, often people will have a disagreement about authorship, and they'll say, fine, we'll be co-first authors, right? Competing is when you just say, this is how it's going to be. That's hard to do when you're at the bottom of a hierarchy, but when you mentor your students, or you have some research staff that you direct, ask yourself if you tend to use competing when you see things differently. And then there's collaborating. Collaborating is when you work really together to come up with a creative new solution. So this is not collaborating like in science, where we think of collaborating, oh, I do these experiments, you do those experiments, we write a paper together. This is you sit together and you really try to come up with a solution that isn't a compromise, it's a win-win for everyone. Whereas compromising is a little bit, I win some, you win some, but I also lose some and you also lose some. So avoiding, accommodating, compromising, competing, and collaborating. And so I don't have time in this workshop today to go through all of those, but the key point of these are all appropriate at some times is the thing I want to leave you with in terms of this workshop. If you want to learn more about this, I'll give you a way to give me input about workshops that you might like, and we can get that to happen. 5 styles. Now, a lot of trainees will tell me it's my boss, so I accommodate all the time. The problem of accommodating all the time or avoiding all the time is you build up resentment and you start to hate your work and you hate going in. Somebody made that comment of, I just never feel very motivated anymore. How do I deal with that? One way is to ask yourself, why might that be happening to me, right? And it could be because there are things that need to be changed and you haven't been willing to bring them up. When you think of this as a conflict grid, you can also think of this as a day-to-day, how do I engage to get my own needs met, right? Do I completely avoid my own needs? Do I always accommodate, right? All right. If, on the other hand, you look up there and you say, well, I'm high on assertiveness and always low on cooperativeness, and I just tell people what I need and I get it, you need to ask yourself, what's the long-term consequences of that? Or think about the long-term consequence of the driver. Maybe I got what I wanted done, but people are alienated. It's hard for me to keep people in my group. It's hard for me to hire. People are avoiding me. Same thing if you compete all the time. Now, collaborating takes a long time. And so we can only really engage in that style when the relationship is super important, right? But so is the outcome, and we have the time to give this. So I had a collaborator. I was at UNC Chapel Hill before I came to NIH, and I had a collaborator, Jack Stutz. We must have published 15 papers together. We probably have 8 joint graduate students and postdocs. That was an important relationship. And sometimes we disagreed about how to put a grant together or a paper together, and we would sit for a long time to try to work it out. Sometimes, though, we didn't have time to sit for a long time and work it out, so we'd compromise. And sometimes Jack would say something that pushed a button of mine and I would choose to avoid because the relationship mattered a lot and it was a little thing. So when it comes to conflict, we need to ask ourselves, does it matter? And that comment about people in the lab making comments about people, you have to ask yourself, is this one to avoid? Or should I go talk to them and say, when you make comments like that, it hurts me. Here's why. Right? And in every interaction, emotionally intelligent people decide, do I want to engage or let it go? Do I want to talk about this one or let it go? Is this more about me or more about them? And what do I want to do about it? There are lots of constructive and destructive behaviors as we develop emotional intelligence around conflict resolution. And I just wanted to give you some here. So some constructive things is to understand this grid and use the right one at the right time. Another is calm and respectful language, appropriate body language, right? And we talked about how hard that can be across cultures, so we have to be really aware, right? And if we think we might have insulted someone, say, did I just say something that was hurtful to you, right? We want to learn as much as we can so that our language and body language can be respectful and calm. We want to acknowledge emotions. Sometimes people just want us to acknowledge how they feel. And so I've noticed sometimes if I just say, you're really angry, huh? Or this is really disappointing to you, huh? It's like, yes, thank you. I used to, when a student didn't get a paper, right, they get a rejection of a paper. So I know, oh, we're likely to get this published somewhere, but for them, it's like, oh, this is my thesis, or this is my first paper, or this really matters to me. I've been working on this forever. And instead of actually sitting for a moment and acknowledging how disappointing it is, I would just be like, oh, this is okay. We'll get this in, or we'll submit it somewhere else. It's no big deal. Sometimes we have to acknowledge emotions. In fact, it's a really good skill. It's a skill that I didn't have because I don't think I was that attuned to emotions, but as I've learned more about them, see how powerful it is. Allowing other people to speak is an important thing. Using paraphrasing, so these are some things about active listening, listening to others, paraphrasing, asking helpful questions. Those are all some of those active listening skills I talked about earlier. Delaying a response if you're angry or upset. Emotionally intelligent people take a deep breath and say, now is not a good time. In the assertiveness workshop, I talked about using I statements instead of saying you did this and you did that. We talk about how the behavior affected you. And then one other thing is we have conflict and then we avoid people for a long time. But really good conflict resolution skills involve also normalizing the relationship afterward, acknowledging that there was a heated moment, apologizing for if you need to apologize, accepting an apology if one is offered or needs to be offered, and moving on. Some destructive things. We avoid conflict at all costs or needing to win at all costs. Yelling, verbal threats, threatening body language, talking over other. Those are all destructive approaches. Now, the thing is that sometimes we feel, particularly if we have a driver style or an emotive style, we think we're talking, but people who have a reflective or amiable style, they sense all that energy and they're like, whoa, right? It just feels overwhelming. So sometimes we think we're not yelling or talking intensely and somebody else does. I think there's cultural baggage around that too, right? Where we, if a woman is assertive, we see it as even more assertive because we are attuned to expecting something more nurturing. I think that there are racial elements to this, you know, where we hear things at a higher pitch than it really is. And so sometimes it's the perception of others, and sometimes it's us, and sometimes it's a mix. And so we want to work on lowering our pitch or calming our body language, but others have to appreciate that our pitch might be higher than them. So there's a lot of flexing to each other. Other destructive things, being sarcastic, demeaning others, dominating the airwaves, i.e. you don't let anybody else talk, saying one thing and meaning another, or being passive aggressive, ignoring each other afterwards, gossiping afterward with other people. These are all destructive approaches to conflict. So I think rather than lecturing about optimism and pessimism for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to take questions. I will get these into some workshop because I think it's helpful. I want to end by saying that all I did today was give you a little bit of a flavor for emotional intelligence and for communication styles. What I want to end by pointing out, often people say, oh, leaders are born. They're not made, right? People are either born a leader or not. So not true. Leadership skills are developed through hard work and practice and desire. They're developed by looking around us at good leaders and aiming to emulate them, and looking around us at people who aren't good leaders and asking, why doesn't that work and how can I learn from that? And sometimes we tend to look, like I said at the beginning, too high up. Look around you at your colleagues, even people maybe who you're more senior than them. Where do they show leadership? Because actually good leaders happen in all kinds of levels. As the OITE was transitioning to telework and thinking about how we were going to support our students, one of the newest people in the office put out an idea about a daily writing support group. And I mean, it was such an incredible sign of leadership. It was a good idea. It was well thought out. It was defended appropriately. It was, I mean, so many parts of it was just an example of leadership. And I saw that happen time and time again in the office. I saw that happen time and time again in my lab. So look for leadership all around you, because there are just all kinds of examples. And it's not that you're born or not born a leader. It's that you decide to invest in becoming a leader or not. Another big myth is that good leadership is all common sense. Actually, some leadership is common sense. A lot of leadership is learning rules and regulations, the ways of your institution, because what was common sense, that's what seemed to work at UNC does not work at NIH. And so it's not all common sense. So you have to appreciate that there's an element of listening to your intuition, but there's a whole lot of learning and reading and studying and talking. And then finally, people say you learn leadership from the school of hard knocks, i.e. you make mistakes and You just dust off your, bruises and go on. And that's a part of leadership. But the best way to learn leadership is intentionally and in advance. And those of you, you all took time to come here today, right? This is the way to learn leadership. But you have to work on the material. You can't just hear it today and say, oh, that was cool. I'll think about this someday. Or you can't just say, boy, now I see some of the ways my PI is a bad leader. Well, now I understand that. You have to really work on the material, and you have to really engage with how can I go further with this. So I'm going to do managing up next week. It's a follow-up to today. I'm going to talk about 7 leadership styles, and then I'm going to flip it. Instead of talking about it as you becoming a leader, I'm going to talk about it. So if your PI is like this, how do you manage that person? We're going to have a workshop on informational interviews and how to do informational interviews. I think that's going to be next Wednesday. I'll do managing up either Monday or Tuesday. I have to look at my calendar. And I think we're going to do a workshop soon on mentoring relationships, probably not next week. Next week on Friday is the NIH Career Symposium. It is open to everyone, and we are starting at noon, so people on the West Coast do not have to get up early. There'll be some live workshops. There'll be some taped material, but it's focused on the breadth of careers available to people with PhDs. So it is a complete misnomer to call something an alternative career. There is no such thing as an alternative careers. All careers in science are valuable. And I invite you to join us at the Career Symposium. I am delighted to share that Dr. Collins, the NIH director, will join us for a very short time at the beginning. He won't take questions, but he has some comments and messages for trainees, especially as you all navigate these really hard times while carrying a lot of stress about your career. This is my email address. First of all, I hope you're going to email me, because you're going to take the opportunity to practice and learn in these small groups. Those of you from NIH know that I'll see you someday and ask you, did you do it? But those of you from other places, this is an experiment. I have about 12 different folks ready to sit with you and talk through this material. And I really hope that you take us up on that invitation. What I'd like to do, if this set works, is after the managing up, have another set of these to talk about difficult PI interactions and sort of maximizing your interactions with your PhD advisor or postdoc advisor. So with that, I am going to take a bunch of questions because there's already a lot. There's a student in our lab, acts as a leader for all of the postdocs, and the advisor has sort of delegated them the leadership role. She doesn't teach us and doesn't allow us to use equipment. How can we communicate with her? Well, this is a great chance to think through how to have a conversation from the perspective of how this impacts you. Remember, you don't want to say you're not supportive or you're a bad mentor. You want to say, I want to share how policies in this lab impact me. You'll want to get advice from that before you do it. This would be a great thing to bring up in the group. So sign up and hopefully you'll get a chance to practice. Here's one about people acting immature and unprofessional and having tantrums. So the best way to deal with that kind of dramatic behavior is what you say, to be calm and reasonable. I think that it's really important not to take the bait and get involved in that. And there's this great management principle of strike while the iron is cold. i.e., don't talk about it right after the tantrum when emotions are still high and frayed. Talk about it at a calm time when you can really address it maybe a little bit more calmly. And maybe you can problem solve together. When you feel that you're getting really angry, maybe you could go take a walk. Maybe you could give me a signal that you need a walk and I can help you with that. There are all kinds of ways that people who have trouble regulating their emotion can learn to do that. But it takes talking with them about it at a time when they're relatively calm, um, or else it's incredibly hard to have any learning. You can watch this again, same link, and eventually it'll go to our YouTube channel, but it's going to take a while. We're way behind. There's a comment here about extroversion and introversion, that it's not true that anyone is one or the other, that the same person can be different depending on mood or situation. Without a doubt, how you feel at the time impacts whether your behaviors in that moment are more extroverted or more introverted. So I'm a pretty serious extrovert, but if I'm not feeling well, I will behave like an introvert. Another thing is, for whatever reason, as extroverted as I can be, parties are not my thing, and I suddenly seem like a pretty introverted person at a party until I talk to one person and get comfortable. So there is certainly context. But when it comes to overall, where do I get my energy? I get my energy by being out and about and talking. So yes, my behaviors can be one or the other. So I tend to think we do have a preference. We just behave based on context. That said, I can tell you that some people think otherwise. And, you know, part of me says it just doesn't matter one bit. What matters is that we use this material to help us get it to do well at work and in life. And here's someone who says that they really feel like an extrovert around science, but an introvert around life. It's just like, oh, I don't want to talk about other things. I'm not interested in that social talk and things, which means that their personal life is at risk of becoming smaller and smaller. The thing is that we all need some balance in our life. None of us really are meant to work all the time. I know that science sends a different message, right? It's like, oh, we come in on Monday and we just want to brag about how many papers we read, and we reviewed grants all weekend, and we did experiments. But the honest truth is that I think the culture of science needs to change in that regard, and appreciate that we do need to expand our lives a little bit. And maybe now is a good time, right? If you want to explore that a little bit more, there's a wellness workshop posted up on the web. So if you go to training.nih.gov, there's a banner that says workshops for students outside the NIH, and there's a wellness workshop, and it talks about sort of the power of having a hobby, and sort of what it means to be well. You know, I didn't used to think this mattered very much, and be like, I'll just drive all the time and work hard, and then I'll get exhausted and I'll sleep a little bit, and then I'll go back and I'll work till I'm exhausted. The honest truth is it's hard to sustain good relationships, and as life goes on, we realize that it's the people that we have, maybe not exactly our papers. It's the difference we made in students' lives. It's our personal relationships. I guess I'd like to encourage you to really try to find a way to connect with people outside of science, and to make that your goal of this workshop. If you don't identify with either introversion or extroversion, then you just have behaviors of both, and there's nothing wrong with that. Pay attention to when it works for you. And in many ways, I think it's way better to be in the middle than be in an extreme. Those of us at an extreme have to work really hard to change. Those in the middle, you know, it comes pretty naturally to either put on our E hat or our I hat. So I think that that's a positive thing, and you should embrace that. I have a problem with interrupting and talking over. It's something I'm trying to get better at. Do you have any suggestions for me? You and I should email each other every day with the number of times we finished people's sentences and talked over. I actually use, this might not work for you, but it works for me, as sometimes as I'm talking with somebody that I know is particularly introverted and needs time, I actually rest my hand on my chin, almost like not over my mouth because that would look weird, but just as a little reminder to myself that I need to slow down. Also, before I go into a meeting now, I'll actually tell myself, listen, go slow. And sometimes afterward, it didn't work so well, and I asked myself why. Those are the kinds of things that start with self-awareness. So you are on your way because you're aware of it. For active listening, how to make repeating, reflecting, summarizing, clarifying not feel like an interruption. Well, one thing, so a little bit of active listening, we can convey we're listening by nodding our head or leaning forward. But when there's a natural pause, that's when you want to do it. So you don't want to be so nervous about using all this that you interrupt. But generally people there's a pause, and that's when you want to do it. The other thing is sometimes people go on and on and on, and you realize, whoa, there's a lot here and I can't even keep all this together. So you might say, I hope it's okay if I interrupt. And then hopefully they'll stop and say yes. All right, so that's the best way to do that. But you're right, it goes on to say, we comment while people are talking, right? And that this can be really, really hard for people from different cultures where the expectation is that people will all be heard and give time to finish. And you're right, there's a lot of cultural things about whether it's okay to cut people off or not. So I spend a lot of time now with my wife's family, and there's a real effort for everybody to listen to everybody. And at the beginning, I thought that was so odd, because that wasn't what happened in my family at all. It was totally fine to have 10 conversations going at once and there's only 6 people in the room, right? So you're even talking to 2 people at once, carrying on 2 conversations. I think that like the question about I talk over people, we want to cue ourselves to slow down a little bit by pausing. If it's in lab meeting, maybe we want to have a decision that people are going to raise their hands or everybody's going to get time, right? It depends on the environment, but we definitely want to put some strategies into place to give people a chance to be heard. What is an effective method of getting constructive feedback on our leadership style from our trainees? I'm going to encourage you to actually sit down with them someday, again, not at a time when you're stressed or they're in the middle of finals or something stressful, and just say, this is a learning experience for both of us, and I would appreciate if do you feel comfortable giving me some feedback? Sometimes people aren't, and so you might say, to be honest, I feel like sometimes I give you way too much to do at the start of the week, and then I don't check in, and I wonder how that feels. So you could even put out on the table things. One of the ways to have people get comfortable with feedback is by giving a lot of small micro doses of feedback and asking for micro doses of feedback yourself. So at the end of a meeting, you might say, too long, too short, just right. Another way is at the end of each week, to sit down and have a regular, this is how we're going to do this. We're going to talk about some things that went well this week. We're going to talk about some things that didn't go quite as well this week. And we're going to give each other a little bit of feedback about how the week went. And if you do that regularly and you show that you're open to their feedback, then they're going to be more and more comfortable about giving it. I'll be honest, sometimes I feel like, I'm no expert at any of this. I've been doing it longer than you, and I've learned some material. I struggle with that too. And now I've come to know that for some people, it's easier to give me feedback than others. And so I try to be available to people and communicate in a way that works for them. So the more analytical communicators, the more introverted people, I'll go into their office, I'll make an appointment, let them know what I want to talk about, show up, sit down, calm down. Somebody else, somebody who's an expressive or driver, I might stop them in the hallway and have a conversation, and they clearly are okay with that. And so I have different styles for each person. Are these sessions for NIH personnel only? No, these sessions are for everyone right now. The Career Symposium is for everyone. All of these workshops are for everyone. The small group discussions are open to everyone at NIH and outside NIH, okay? Absolutely. I mean, one of the things right now, given the complexity of these times, the NIH needs to do everything it can to support trainees everywhere. Our trainees are learning from people at universities. I'm sure you'll learn by talking with our trainees. I mean, this is one community of science, so you are all invited. In terms of those workshops, somebody said, can we be anonymous during the workshop? I actually, in the email that I'll send you, it makes a plea that you actually join with your name and that you turn on the camera. Because, like I said, we need to grow and learn, which means we're outside of our comfort zone. There is no one in the group that you know. And if you get there and there's someone you know and you'd rather come to another one because of what you're going to talk about, that's fine. But I think it's important not to sort of silently lurk in the background. The other reason we're asking people to put their name up there is, you know, using Zoom, people can be really terrible and all kinds of Zoom bombing. And we had a meditation group interrupted by somebody yelling really hateful speech. And so when somebody registers with just 3 letters or something, we're worried that it's someone like that. So I'm going to encourage you to talk, actually, if you want to, reach out to me about why you want to do it anonymously, and maybe you and I can talk about it. Suddenly no sound. I hope that's not for everyone. I rarely have an assertive communication style unless I'm upset, right? And that tends to happen a lot. And what happens is that assertive communication style is fueled by anger. And that's why we don't want to avoid and accommodate all the time. Because then by the time we speak up, it's like we're way past our emotional intelligence into a really aggressive or passive aggressive way. Some of us who can't be assertive easily will be passive aggressive instead. So we'll say one thing but do another behind people's backs. And that's why we want to learn, if we can, how to be more assertive. The other thing is, this same questioner points out, sometimes I can really shut down when I'm working with a driver or an expressive. So one of the things that we learn about in managing up is, first of all, to get to know the style of the people who matter to us and to prepare ourselves for that. I think there are people in my office who literally sit in their office and psych themselves up. I can do this. Sharon will give me 20 ideas, but at the end I'll say, which one do you want me to work on? I can do this. Sometimes we really just have to psych ourselves up to engage with someone whose style is different than ours. We want to match their style a little bit. We also need to appreciate that their style is different. And so we maybe don't hear it quite the same. And in that People Styles at Work book that I talked about, based on that 4-quadrant, there's a beautiful set of, if you are an amiable and you work with a driver, here are things to remember. Sometimes having an agenda can help as well in that case. I just repeated the name of the book on communication. It's called People Styles at Work, and it's by Bolton and Bolton. There is an agenda for the Career Symposium. I think it's online, and if it's not, it will be up there any day soon. Here's an observation so true that it's tempting for high-achieving scientists to sacrifice their personal development in favor of short-term success in their research. It really leads to an imbalance of skill sets, right? You really excel at the bench, but you're not a very well-rounded person. I think that's true. I made comments about that a little bit earlier. I think what's happened in the past is that trainees choose labs based on the science only, and sometimes really poor behavior gets rewarded by that. And I think the more we tell our first year graduate students and our undergrads and people looking for postdocs that it's science plus environment and that they're both important. And the more we do that, the more people will learn that I can't ignore these kinds of skills. People call them soft skills. Like, really? Actually, there's nothing soft about any of this. You've asked hard questions, right? These are hard skills. So I think the more we embrace that, and the more we don't allow bad managers to thrive. So the more we say, I'm not going there, because I talked to 5 people who left and none of them were happy, and I won't break the mold. See, we think we're going to break the mold. We hear somebody's difficult, oh, I'll be okay. It'll be worth it because I'll get a paper. And then one day we realize they beat the love of science out of us. And so hopefully over time, we will all appreciate we have to develop these hard leadership skills. You register for the Career Symposium online. The slides will come in the email tomorrow. There is not a strategy for hiring the right combination of introverts and extroverts in your group. It really depends on the group. And remember, people can come and interview and be something that one day. I think the thing is to pay attention if you're biased against one or the other. So we have maybe we'll do a workshop on picking students and hiring, just if you think that would help. Because I think we all tend to want to hire people who are like us, whether that be look like us, sound like us. Sometimes, right, you bond over some hobby and before you know it, you're just hiring them because they love the same thing you love. Because of all those kinds of biases in hiring, we use a committee. We make sure the committee is diverse in many, many ways. And that way we tend to hire people because they have a skill set and ask the right questions and bring the right things to the table. And then we have to make it work for extroverts and introverts, right? And we work together as a group. And here's a comment from somebody who's a native Spanish speaker who says that it's a language difference that makes me an introvert in English. I'm an extrovert in Spanish, but an introvert in English. I would say that the same for me when I use my about 12th grade Spanish. Suddenly I will get quiet and stay quiet. And I mean, that's a lot. That's asking a lot of yourself as you're translating from one language into another. My hope is that over time and with practice, you will be able to be a little bit less introverted in English, and over time, less so, less so, less so. That said, we all learn language at the way we learn it, right? And for some of us, I think that that's probably a pretty long-term issue, that we're not authentic, we're not able to be completely who we are in another language. Somebody says they're impressed by my ability to read and paraphrase the questions. I hope that you all agree. Sometimes I feel like I didn't get it quite right. Somebody here says host a webinar on hiring, and I will think about that. And then there's a bunch of thank yous. So we're going to wrap up because it's 5:04 and we were supposed to be done at 5 o'clock. Every workshop here that I've done actually at NIH before this, but also all of these online and when I travel and go to meetings, this is the generation of scientists who are going to make science better, more inclusive, more welcoming, more human. I mean, I really have some optimism about science when I read all of your questions. And so I thank all of you for coming. I'm really grateful that you logged on. I will really be happy if you email me and consider doing some of the groups. Thank you all very, very much. And here is a a book recommendation, Do You Speak Science? Dialect and Its Role in Research Training. Thank you for recommending that. I'll make sure to order it for our OITE library for our visiting fellows. Thank you all, and I will hopefully talk with you again. And I look forward to a day someday when I can actually be back in a room and interacting with all of you. So thank you all and have a great night.